In a quaint Kentucky suburb, a prejudiced HOA president tried to evict a resilient black woman from her dream home, until Danielle Carter revealed a stunning secret that turned the tables, exposing her bias and transforming the neighborhood forever. Danielle Carter eased her beat-up Ford truck into the driveway of her new home in Lexington, Kentucky, her fingers still tacky with grease from a long day at the auto shop. At 38, she was a talented mechanic, a single mom to her 10-year-old daughter Jayla, and now, after years of scraping together every dime, the proud owner of a modest 2-story house in the upscale Willow Creek Estates. The house was a vision of hope, its white picket fence framing a small front yard where vibrant hydrangeas bloomed in shades of violet and blue, their petals swaying gently in the breeze. A perfect spot for Jayla to ride her bike. A fresh start in a community Danielle prayed would welcome them warmly. She'd spent countless nights dreaming of this moment, picturing Jayla running through the grass, her laughter filling the air, while Danielle finally had a place to call her own, after years of renting cramped apartments, always on the edge of making ends meet. But from the moment she arrived, she felt an icy undercurrent, as if the neighborhood itself was sizing her up. Curtains twitched behind pastel-colored shutters, eyes peered from manicured hedges, and hushed whispers trailed her like shadows, their weight heavier than she cared to admit. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination, the nerves of starting over in a place so different from the bustling city streets she'd grown up on. But the stares lingered, sharp and unyielding, a silent judgment she couldn't ignore. 3 days after settling in, Danielle sat on her porch, savoring a rare moment of peace with a mug of coffee, the steam curling into the crisp morning air as she watched Jayla skip rope in the front yard, her giggles filling the air like music. Jayla's bright pink rope slapped rhythmically against the pavement, her small sneakers scuffing the ground as she chanted a rhyme she'd learned at school, her braids bouncing with each jump. Danielle smiled, her heart swelling with pride at the sight of her daughter, so full of life, so unaware of the challenges that had brought them here. She'd worked double shifts at the shop, fixed cars through the night, and skipped meals to save for this house, all to give Jayla the stability she'd never had growing up. The morning felt like a small victory, a moment of calm after the chaos of moving, until the sharp clack of heels on pavement shattered the serenity. A woman in her late 50s approached, her posture rigid, her face locked in a tight-lipped smile that never reached her icy blue eyes. She wore a tailored blazer, its gray fabric pristine against the morning light, a pearl necklace that caught the sunlight with each step, and an air of authority that made Danielle's stomach knot. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice crisp and cutting, her gaze flicking to Jayla, before settling on Danielle with a scrutiny that felt like a silent accusation. "I'm Evelyn Harper, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." Danielle stood, brushing her hands on her jeans, her palms suddenly clammy as she offered a genuine smile, despite the tension coiling in her chest. "Nice to meet you, I know who you are," Evelyn cut in, her tone sharp as a whip, her eyes narrowing as she thrust a folded piece of paper into Danielle's hands, her movements brisk, almost aggressive. "This is a welcome packet. We have standards here, and I expect you to follow them." Danielle unfolded the paper, her fingers tracing the crisp edges as she scanned the HOA rules. Lawn height limits, approved paint colors, trash bin schedules. It all seemed routine, but Evelyn's tone carried a venom that made Danielle's heart sink, a quiet warning she couldn't ignore. She glanced up at Evelyn, searching for a hint of warmth, but found only a cold, calculated stare, one that seemed to look right through her, as if she didn't belong here, as if her very presence was an affront to the neighborhood's perfection. The next morning, that warning became a reality. Danielle stepped outside to grab the newspaper, the cool air brushing against her skin as she adjusted her worn jacket, and froze when she saw a notice taped to her front door. The Willow Creek HOA logo glaring at her in bold print. "Violation, unauthorized vehicle in driveway," it read, pointing to her work truck, the faded blue Ford she used to tow clients' cars, its paint gleaming under the morning sun. Danielle's brow furrowed as she glanced at the truck, parked neatly in her driveway, a testament to the years she'd spent building her business from nothing. She'd seen neighbors with boats and RVs parked out front, their lawns decorated with cheerful welcome signs, yet no notices marred their doors. The unfairness of it stung, a sharp pang in her chest as she realized this wasn't just about the truck. It was about her, about the assumptions Evelyn had made the moment she saw her. She tore the paper down, her jaw clenching, her fingers trembling slightly as she fought to stay calm. Maybe Evelyn was just a stickler for rules, she told herself, trying to cling to a shred of optimism. But by the end of the week, another notice arrived, this time for improper lawn maintenance. Her grass was barely an inch over the limit, a task she and Jayla had tackled together just 2 days ago, laughing as they wrestled with the old mower. Jayla's small hands gripping the handle as she insisted on helping. The memory of that day, Jayla's proud grin, the way she'd beamed when Danielle praised her effort, made the notice feel like a personal attack, a deliberate attempt to erase the joy they'd found in their new home. Danielle stood on her porch, the paper crumpled in her fist, her frustration boiling over as she caught Evelyn driving by in her sleek BMW, her gaze fixed on Danielle with a smug satisfaction that set her nerves on fire. This wasn't about rules, it was about her, about the color of her skin, and Danielle felt a spark of defiance flare within her, a fire that had been simmering since the first time she'd felt those judgmental stares. She thought of her late mother, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, who'd taught her to stand tall no matter what the world threw at her, and that fire grew stronger. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much to give Jayla this home, a place where her daughter could grow up without the weight of the struggles Danielle had known. And she wasn't about to let Evelyn tear it all away. She straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening like steel, and made a silent promise to herself. She wasn't going anywhere, and she'd fight for her place here, no matter what it took. Evelyn's attacks didn't let up. They grew sharper, more relentless, as if she'd made it her mission to drive Danielle out. Over the next 2 weeks, Danielle's mailbox turned into a war zone, overflowing with violation notices that seemed to multiply overnight. Trash bins out too early, flagged for rolling them out at 5:55 a.m., just 5 minutes shy of the allowed time. A rule she'd never seen enforced on anyone else. Unapproved porch decorations, targeting a small planter Jayla had painted with bright yellow sunflowers, a project that had filled a sunny afternoon with laughter, Jayla's eyes sparkling with pride as she presented it to Danielle. Even excessive noise, absurdly citing Jayla's skipping rope in the yard as a disturbance, despite the fact that the neighborhood kids often played louder games without a single complaint. Danielle tried to keep the peace, dragging herself out of bed before dawn to move the bins, her eyes bleary with exhaustion as she stumbled through the dark, taking down the planter despite Jayla's disappointed pout, her daughter's voice trembling as she asked, "Why don't they like my flowers, Mommy?" The question broke Danielle's heart, a crack that widened each time she had to keep Jayla indoors after school, her heart breaking as Jayla's joyful giggles faded behind closed doors, replaced by the muted sounds of cartoons on the living room TV. But the notices kept coming, each one more trivial than the last, a barrage that felt like a calculated assault, designed to wear her down, to make her feel like she didn't belong. One evening, after a brutal 14-hour shift fixing a client's transmission, her shoulders aching from hours bent over engines, her hands still reeking of motor oil, Danielle came home to find a new notice taped to her truck's windshield. Unauthorized commercial vehicle, remove immediately or face fines. Her hands trembled as she ripped it off, her exhaustion giving way to a searing anger that burned through her veins, a fury that made her vision blur with unshed tears. She'd parked that truck in the same spot since day one. Why was it only a problem now? She thought of the other neighbors, their pristine SUVs and boats untouched by notices, and the unfairness of it all hit her like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the battles she'd fought her whole life just to be seen as equal. As she stood there, her breath coming in ragged bursts, her hands still clutching the crumpled notice, a voice broke through her fury, soft but steady, cutting through the haze of her anger like a lifeline. "She's been doing that to folks for years," said Clara, a 45-year-old florist who lived across the street, her tone warm but edged with a simmering resentment that mirrored Danielle's own. Clara adjusted her gardening gloves, her dark eyes flashing with defiance as she glanced toward Evelyn's house down the block, its pristine white exterior glowing under the streetlights, a stark contrast to the warmth in Clara's expression. "I'm Clara. I've seen her target anyone who doesn't fit her idea of perfect. She tried to fine me for my flower shop van last year, claimed it lowered property values, even though I park it in my garage every night." Danielle turned to her, her anger cooling into a flicker of hope, a small beacon in the storm Evelyn had unleashed. Clara handed her a business card, its corners slightly bent but the gesture heartfelt, her smile warm yet tinged with the weariness of her own struggles with the HOA. "If you need someone to back you up, I'm here," she said, her words a quiet act of kindness that made Danielle's chest tighten with gratitude, a wave of relief washing over her as she realized she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. She thought of the stories her mother used to tell, of neighbors banding together in the face of hardship, sharing what little they had to lift each other up. And Clara's offer felt like a small echo of that spirit, a reminder that there were still people who saw her, who cared. For the first time since moving in, she felt a glimmer of strength, a spark of courage that reignited the fire within her. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't going to let Evelyn break her without a fight. But Evelyn wasn't done, her attacks growing bolder, more insidious. The next day, Danielle opened her mailbox with a sense of dread, her fingers hesitating as she pulled out a formal HOA letter, its tone colder and more menacing than the notices before it, the paper heavy in her hands as if it carried the weight of Evelyn's malice. The letter accused her of suspicious activity. Due to frequent vehicle traffic, her clients occasionally dropped off cars for minor repairs, a lifeline for her small business, a necessity to keep the lights on and food on the table for Jayla. It demanded she submit proof of home ownership within 48 hours or face further action, a phrase that sent a shiver down her spine, its vagueness only amplifying the threat. Danielle's stomach churned as she read the words, the racist undertone as clear as day. A slap in the face after all she'd sacrificed to buy this house. She had poured every penny of her savings into this home, every late night at the shop, every missed school event for Jayla, all to give her daughter the life she deserved. Why was she the only one being questioned? She thought of the other neighbors, the ones with boats and RVs, the ones who never seemed to face scrutiny, and the injustice of it all made her hands shake, her breath hitching as she fought back the tears threatening to spill. She glanced at Jayla, who was kneeling on the driveway, drawing a rainbow with chalk, her tiny hands covered in pastel dust, her face lit up with a joy that Danielle was determined to protect. The sight of her daughter, so innocent, so unaware of the battle Danielle was fighting, filled her with a fierce determination that surged through her like a tidal wave, washing away the fear and replacing it with resolve. Evelyn thought she could intimidate her into leaving, that she could break her spirit with rules and threats. But she'd just made a big mistake. Danielle wasn't going anywhere, and she was ready to fight back. Not just for herself, but for Jayla, for Clara, for every person Evelyn had ever tried to push out, a fire burning in her chest that no amount of notices could extinguish. Danielle knew she had to take action, but Evelyn's position as HOA president made things tricky, a wall of power that seemed impenetrable. She called the HOA office, her voice steady despite the nerves that twisted her stomach into knots, and requested a meeting to address the violations that had piled up like a storm cloud over her new life. The response was as cold as she'd feared. "The board only intervenes if there's property damage," the woman on the phone said, her tone flat and disinterested, as if Danielle's struggle was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Have you tried speaking with Miss Harper directly?" Danielle sighed, her grip tightening on the phone, the plastic creaking under her fingers. "She won't listen," she replied, her voice tinged with frustration, the memory of Evelyn's smug smile flashing in her mind. The woman offered to send a formal email, but Danielle knew it wouldn't do anything. Evelyn was untouchable, a queen on her throne of petty rules, and Danielle felt the weight of that power pressing down on her, threatening to crush the hope she'd clung to since Clara's kind words. She hung up, her shoulders slumping, the silence of her kitchen amplifying the thud of her heartbeat as she stared at the stack of notices on the counter, their edges curling from being handled so many times. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her living room, Danielle sat at her dining table, sorting through her property documents to prepare for the HOA's demand for proof of ownership, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. She had always been meticulous, keeping every receipt, every contract, a habit born from years of having to prove herself in a world that often doubted her worth. And then, she stumbled across something she'd overlooked during the purchase, a lien notice tied to Evelyn's house down the street, 112 Willow Lane, its address printed in bold black ink at the top of the page. Her breath caught in her throat as she read further, her eyes widening with each line. Evelyn had defaulted on her HOA fees years ago, a debt that had spiraled out of control, and her house had been quietly sold at auction to settle it. Purchased by none other than Danielle's real estate investment group, a side business she'd started to secure Jayla's future, a safety net she'd built with the same grit that had gotten her through every late night at the shop. She stared at the paperwork, her heart racing as the realization hit her like a thunderclap. She owned Evelyn's house, and Evelyn had no idea. She hadn't planned to act on it. Until now. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a weapon, a chance to turn the tables on the woman who'd made her life a living nightmare, and Danielle felt a surge of empowerment ripple through her. A fire that had been smoldering since the first violation notice, now roaring to life. She thought of Jayla, of the life she was fighting for, and knew she had to use this to protect her daughter, to protect her home. The next day, Evelyn escalated her attack, as if sensing Danielle's newfound resolve. She showed up at Danielle's door, clipboard in hand, her pearl necklace glinting under the sunlight, her smile as fake as ever, a mask that barely concealed the disdain in her eyes. "I'm here to follow up on the proof of ownership," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, each word a calculated jab meant to make Danielle feel small. "We've had complaints about your presence here." Danielle's jaw clenched, the word presence hitting her like a slap, its racist undertone unmistakable, a reminder of every time she'd been made to feel like she didn't belong. But she kept her cool, her hands steady as she pulled out her phone, her voice firm despite the anger bubbling inside her. "I've got something better," she said, tapping the record button, her eyes locking onto Evelyn's. "I'm recording this. You've been harassing me for weeks, and now you're questioning my right to be here? I'm done playing nice." Evelyn's smile faltered for a split second, a crack in her facade, her fingers tightening around her clipboard as a flicker of unease crossed her face. But she quickly recovered, letting out a sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed in the quiet morning air. "Do what you must, Danielle," she said, her voice cold and cutting, her eyes narrowing into slits. "But you'll find rules are rules, and I enforce them, whether you like it or not." The words were a veiled threat, a reminder of Evelyn's power, meant to intimidate Danielle into submission, but Danielle stood taller, her resolve hardening, the fire in her chest burning brighter than ever. She thought of her mother's words, "Never let them see you break," and felt a quiet strength settle over her, a strength that Evelyn's arrogance couldn't touch. She had a plan, a secret that would shatter Evelyn's world, and she was ready to use it, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination as she prepared for the battle ahead. Danielle didn't waste another second, her mind racing with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She contacted her real estate attorney, Mia Torres, a sharp-witted woman who'd helped her build her investment portfolio, her voice steady as she spoke into the phone, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "I need everything on 112 Willow Lane," she said, her tone firm, her fingers gripping the receiver as if it were a lifeline. "And I need it fast." Mia chuckled on the other end, her voice warm but laced with a knowing edge. "You're about to make someone's day real bad, aren't you?" she said, and Danielle couldn't help but smile, a small, fierce grin that felt like a victory in itself. By the next morning, Mia had delivered the deed to Danielle's house, the purchase agreement for Evelyn's, and a detailed record of Evelyn's unpaid HOA fees, over $5,000, 0 cents in debt she'd ignored for years, a sum that had quietly accumulated while Evelyn played dictator over the neighborhood. Danielle held the documents in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages, each one a piece of ammunition in the fight she'd been forced into, a fight she was now ready to win. She wasn't just going to defend herself, she was going to dismantle Evelyn's reign. To show the neighborhood the truth behind the woman who'd terrorized so many. That evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting at the community center, the air thick with tension as neighbors filled the room, their whispers a low hum that buzzed like a swarm of bees, their eyes darting between Danielle and Evelyn with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her hands folded neatly in front of her as if she were untouchable, a queen presiding over her court. "We're here to address Ms. Carter's violations," she began, her voice syrupy but sharp, a blade hidden in honey as she held up a stack of notices, their edges pristine, a testament to her obsessive control. "Given the numerous complaints—" "I'd like to speak," Danielle interrupted, her tone calm but unyielding, her voice cutting through the room like a knife as she stood, a folder in hand, her heart pounding but her hand steady. Evelyn's lips thinned, her eyes flashing with irritation, but she gestured for Danielle to continue, her fingers tapping impatiently on the table, a subtle sign of the cracks beginning to form in her armor. Danielle opened the folder, pulling out the first document with a deliberate slowness, her movements measured, her gaze steady as she held it up for the room to see. "This is the deed to my house," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the silent room. "Filed, recorded, and indisputable. I own my home, and I've followed every rule, unlike some people here." A murmur spread through the crowd, a ripple of surprise as Danielle pulled out the second document, her voice steady but growing with a power she hadn't felt in weeks. "And this is the purchase agreement for 112 Willow Lane, Evelyn Harper's house." The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room, as every pair of eyes turned to Evelyn, her face draining of color, her hands gripping the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Danielle continued, her voice rising with a fierce determination, each word a hammer striking at Evelyn's facade. "I bought your house at auction last year to settle your unpaid HOA fees, Evelyn. You've been living on my property, and you had no idea." Gasps rippled through the room, neighbors turning to each other in shock, their whispers growing into a chorus of disbelief as Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed, her composure crumbling like a house of cards, her usual smugness replaced by a stunned silence that spoke louder than any words. Danielle pulled out the final document, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury, her eyes locked on Evelyn's. "And this," she said, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with the weight of truth, "is a record of your $5,000 0 cents debt to the HOA. Debt you've ignored while trying to evict me from my own home." The crowd erupted in whispers, their support shifting to Danielle like a tide turning, their murmurs a wave of solidarity that warmed her heart, a validation of the fight she'd endured. Clara stood up, her voice loud and clear, cutting through the chaos with a fierce conviction. "I've seen her target others like this," she said, pointing at Evelyn, her dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. "She thinks she can control who belongs here, but she's the one breaking the rule." Evelyn's face turned crimson, her hands shaking as she scrambled for a response, her voice trembling as she stammered, This is outrageous." But her words fell flat, her authority slipping away like sand through her fingers. Danielle looked her in the eye, her voice steady, her heart pounding with a mix of triumph and relief. "I fix cars for a living, Evelyn. I keep things running, and I'm not going to let you break me or this community because of the color of my skin. You picked the wrong person to mess with, someone who'd do anything to protect her daughter's future." The fallout from the HOA meeting rippled through Willow Creek Estates like a shockwave, leaving the community buzzing with a mix of disbelief, outrage, and a newfound respect for Danielle that she could feel in the air like a warm breeze after a storm. Evelyn, her once imposing presence reduced to a shadow of its former self, resigned. As HOA president the very next day, her signature on the letter shaky, a stark contrast to the confident, cutting handwriting Danielle had seen on countless violation notices, each one a reminder of the battle she'd fought. Neighbors who'd once whispered behind closed curtains, their voices low and tinged with suspicion, now approached Danielle with nods of acknowledgement, their faces softened with a quiet admiration that made her chest tighten with a bittersweet pride she hadn't expected to feel. Clara led the charge, rallying the community to nominate Danielle as the new HOA president, her voice ringing with conviction as she stood on her front lawn, clipboard in hand, gathering signatures under the shade of a sprawling oak tree whose branches swayed gently in the late afternoon breeze. "You've shown us what standing up looks like," Clara said, her eyes warm with gratitude, her hands steady as she handed Danielle the petition, its pages filled with names of neighbors Danielle had barely spoken to before. Names like Mr. Thompson, the quiet retiree who always waved from his porch, and the young couple, the Hendersons, who'd just moved in with their newborn. The weight of their trust settled over her, a heavy but welcome burden, and she felt a flicker of hope ignite within her, a hope that this community, once so cold and unwelcoming, could become the home she'd dreamed of for Jayla, a place where her daughter could grow up surrounded by acceptance, not judgment. But not everyone was ready to let go of the past, and the undercurrent of resistance that lingered in the neighborhood reminded Danielle that the fight for justice was never truly over. A small group of Evelyn's loyalists, led by a retired accountant named Marjorie, tried to stir trouble, spreading rumors that Danielle had fabricated the documents to humiliate Evelyn, their voices dripping with skepticism as they huddled in Marjorie's driveway, casting sidelong glances at Danielle's house, their eyes narrowed with a suspicion that felt all too familiar. Marjorie, a wiry woman with a pinched face and a penchant for drama, even taped a flyer to the community bulletin board, its bold red letters proclaiming, "Who really owns 112 Willow Lane?" The flyer was a cheap piece of printer paper, its edges curling in the humidity, but its words were sharp, designed to cut through the fragile unity Danielle had begun to build, to sow doubt in the minds of those who'd just started to trust her. Clara tore it down within hours, her hands shaking with anger as she crumpled the paper, her voice low and fierce as she muttered, "They'll never learn," before tossing it into the trash with a force that spoke volumes about her frustration. But the whispers lingered, a bitter reminder of the prejudice Danielle had fought so hard to overcome, each rumor a sharp jab that threatened to unravel the victory she'd fought for with every ounce of her strength. The accusations stung, a deep, aching pain that brought back memories of the violation notices, of Evelyn's cold stares, of the way she'd felt so small under the weight of the neighborhood's judgment. She thought of Jayla, of the way her daughter had asked, "Why don't they like my flowers, Mommy?" And the pain deepened, a raw wound that made her hands tremble as she stood in her kitchen, staring at the petition Clara had given her, the names on the page blurring as tears welled in her eyes. Danielle refused to let the rumors break her, her resolve hardening like steel as she wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders, the fire that had carried her through the HOA meeting reigniting within her. She met with her attorney Mia to ensure every document was airtight, her voice steady as she spoke, her resolve unshaken despite the exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders after weeks of sleepless nights. Each one spent replaying the meeting, the accusations, the victory that had felt so hard won. "I've got the truth on my side," she told Mia, her tone firm, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she sat in Mia's small office, the walls lined with law books that seemed to hold the weight of justice itself. Their spines faded, but sturdy, a testament to the battles they'd seen. Mia nodded, her sharp eyes glinting with confidence as she slid a notarized copy of the deed across the desk, its seal gleaming under the fluorescent light, a small but powerful symbol of Danielle's rightful place in this fight. "They can whisper all they want," Mia said, her voice a quiet reassurance that cut through the noise of doubt in Danielle's mind, "but they can't change the facts. You own that house, and you've earned your place here." Danielle took the document, her fingers brushing against the crisp paper, and felt a renewed strength surge within her, a quiet determination to protect the future she'd built for Jayla, no matter how many whispers tried to tear it down. She thought of her mother, who'd always said, "The truth will stand when nothing else does," and felt a wave of gratitude for the lessons that had carried her through this storm. Lessons that had taught her to stand tall, to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed stacked against her. Evelyn, meanwhile, was forced to face the consequences of her actions in a way she'd never imagined, her fall from grace as swift as it was humbling. With her debt exposed, the HOA board demanded immediate payment of the $5,000.00 she owed, a sum she couldn't produce without selling her prized BMW, the same car she'd driven so proudly past Danielle's house. Her gaze always laced with smug satisfaction, her presence a constant reminder of the power she'd once wielded. The car was gone within a week, replaced by a dented sedan that sat awkwardly in her driveway, its faded paint a stark contrast to the pristine exterior of her home, its chipped fender a quiet testament to the life Evelyn had lost. Neighbors watched as Evelyn packed boxes into the trunk of her new car, her movements stiff, her pearl necklace replaced by a simple scarf that did little to hide the strain on her face, the lines etched deep around her eyes, the weight of her shame visible in every step she took. She was moving out, unable to afford the home she'd lived in for over a decade, not because Danielle had evicted her, but because the shame of her exposure and the financial burden of her debt had left her with no choice. Her pride shattered like glass under the weight of her own actions. Danielle stood on her porch, watching from a distance as Evelyn loaded the last box, her heart a tangled mix of emotions. Satisfaction at seeing justice served, but also a quiet sadness for the woman who'd let prejudice destroy her own life. She thought of her mother's words, "Hate only hurts the one who holds it," and felt a pang of understanding. A realization that Evelyn's downfall was as much her own doing as it was Danielle's victory. A lesson in the cost of letting bitterness guide your actions. She turned away, her gaze settling on Jayla, who was skipping rope in the yard, her bright pink rope slapping rhythmically against the pavement, her laughter a bright melody that filled the air, and felt a deep, unshakable gratitude for the fight she'd won, for the home she'd protected, and for the community that was finally beginning to feel like hers, a place where Jayla could grow up free from the shadows of hate that had once loomed so large. Danielle's first act as the new HOA president was to rewrite the rules that had been weaponized against her, her pen moving with a steady determination as she sat at her dining table, a cup of coffee cooling beside her, its steam curling into the air like a quiet promise of new beginnings. She abolished the petty regulations about trash bin schedules and porch decorations, her fingers trembling slightly with the weight of the moment, each stroke of her pen a step toward healing the wounds this community had inflicted on her and so many others. She replaced them with guidelines that encouraged community and fairness, her handwriting neat and deliberate, a reflection of the care she put into every decision, her mind racing with ideas for a better future. Block parties, community gardens, spaces where neighbors could come together instead of tearing each other apart. She introduced a new rule requiring transparency in HOA decisions, ensuring no one could be targeted the way she had been. Her voice firm as she presented the changes at the next community meeting, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of dissent, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and hope as she stood at the podium, the same podium where Evelyn had once wielded her power like a weapon. The neighbors nodded in approval, their faces a mix of respect and relief, and Clara gave her a small, proud smile from the back of the room, her hands clasped in front of her as if in silent applause, her eyes shining with a warmth that made Danielle's throat tighten with emotion. Danielle felt a swell of pride in her chest, a warmth that spread through her as she realized she was not just fixing a broken system, but building a better one for everyone, a legacy she could leave for Jayla, a promise that her daughter would grow up in a community that valued her for who she was, not the color of her skin, a place where she could ride her bike, and paint her planters without fear of judgment. The neighborhood began to transform in the weeks that followed, the air lighter, the tension that had once hung over Willow Creek Estates, replaced by a tentative sense of unity that grew stronger with each passing day. Neighbors who'd once kept to themselves started hosting potlucks, their laughter spilling into the evening air as they shared stories over plates of homemade food. Clara's famous peach cobbler, Mr. Thompson's grilled ribs, the Hendersons' potato salad. Their children playing together in the yards without fear of violation notices, their voices a joyful cacophony that filled the streets with life. Jayla's planter, the one with the bright yellow sunflowers, was returned to the porch by a shy neighbor named Mrs. Ellis, a widow who'd lived down the street for years but had never spoken to Danielle before, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her hands trembling slightly as she set the planter down, its painted flowers still vibrant despite the weeks it had spent in storage. "I always thought it was lovely," Mrs. Ellis said, her voice soft, her eyes crinkling with a kindness Danielle hadn't expected, a kindness that felt like a small but significant step toward healing. Danielle smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet joy as she thanked Mrs. Ellis, her hands brushing against the planter as she placed it back in its rightful spot, a symbol of the change she'd fought for, a reminder of the day Jayla had painted it, her small hands covered in yellow paint, her laughter echoing through the yard. Jayla ran out to see, her eyes lighting up as she clapped her hands, her voice a delighted squeal as she said, "My flowers are back, Mummy! Can we paint more?" Danielle pulled her daughter into a tight hug, her arms wrapping around Jayla's small frame, the scent of her strawberry shampoo filling her senses, and felt a profound peace settle over her, a peace she hadn't known since the day they'd moved in. A peace born from knowing she'd not only protected her daughter's home, but helped create a community where Jayla could thrive, where her creativity could bloom without fear. As the weeks turned into months, Danielle settled into her role as HOA president. Her days filled with meetings and decisions, but also with moments of connection that made every challenge worth it. Helping the Hendersons organize a baby shower, joining Mr. Thompson for coffee on his porch, watching Jayla play tag with the other kids at the first block party she'd organized, their laughter a soundtrack to the new life she was building. She often thought of Evelyn, who'd moved to a small apartment on the other side of Lexington, her once pristine life a distant memory, her name rarely mentioned in the neighborhood anymore, as if the community had collectively decided to leave her in the past. Danielle didn't harbor resentment, but she couldn't forget the lessons Evelyn's actions had taught her, about the cost of prejudice, the power of resilience, and the strength of a community that chooses to stand together, to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. One evening, as she sat on her porch, watching Jayla ride her bike down the sidewalk, her small helmet glinting in the setting sun, her laughter echoing through the quiet street, Danielle felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a certainty that she'd turned a place of struggle into a place of belonging. She'd fought for her home, for her daughter, and for a future where no one would have to face the kind of hate she'd endured. And in doing so, she'd found her own place in Willow Creek Estates. A place where she and Jayla could finally, truly belong. A place where the hydrangeas bloomed brighter, the air felt sweeter, and the future stretched out before them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled.